Greetings. What's up to the family? How y'all doing? On this episode, I want to answer a question that was presented to me. It was through email, and actually, I'm going to make this into, I guess, like two segments, two separate segments. So hopefully, you can kind of like, I don't want to talk about it all in one segment to just drop it all on you, but I'll make it into two segments. But the question was asked of me because I do a lot of talking about reptilians and aliens and different forms of extraterrestrial. I guess you can call them races if you want to call them, or species. And the question was asked to me, it was a particular brother that, I call you actually a melanated brother, or, I would call you a melanated person, but you may consider yourself black or what may have you. But he identified his race to me, and, particular race, because I don't consider melanated people a race, and I don't consider any, I guess you can say, human species a race. There's only one race, which is the human race. But he identified himself as a melanated person, and he asked me, basically, how do I feel about reptilians in reference to reptilians being more so white people than black people. And he basically, where he was coming at from that is that he said he researched David Icke. And he said that David Icke, talks about reptilians as if they're someone different from him and who he is. And he said basically most of the information that he heard about from the reptilians came from, I guess you could say, European sources or so-called white people sources. And he basically is saying that when he hears me talk about reptilians, he kind of feels as though I'm kind of like talking against our people, because I guess this particular person considers himself a descendant of the reptilians that, presented this particular question to me. So, what I want to do is just kind of clarify some things about my perspective on reptilians, what I feel about reptilians, as far as the race and how they originated, and kind of maybe just brighten up things to help you to understand where I'm really coming from with this thing. Now, when you think about this whole reptilian thing, the first thing you're going to have to remember is that say for instance, if you are a melanated person, and even if you're not a melanated person even, you ascended as a human being in general, this vessel is separate from your origination, from your soul's origination. Your soul can be millions of years old, and this vessel may only be, as far as the human vessel is, like what they say humans are only 500,000 years old as far as this version of a human vessel, this version that we are in now, the Homo sapiens vessel, that walks upright, that breathes air, and that, basically this particular version, because there's different versions of Homo sapiens. Like you had a group of Homo sapiens that knew how to fly, as I talked about on the pygmy episode, and that's a kind of a different version of Homo sapien. But this version of Homo sapien that you are in this body is only about 500,000 years old. But you as a human, I guess you could say as a soul, this is what you are. You are not your body. Your body is called, in ancient philosophy, is called the separate self. You are much more than your body. And that's what you have to realize. Like, you are a soul. You are what some people would call an etheric being. You come from the ethers. So if you come from the ethers, you are much older than any physical species out there, because the ethers and the etheric beings this is going past human, or I guess you could say matter, physical species. So for you to identify with any physical species, whether it's insectilian, whether it's white, black, Asiatic, whatever, that's fine if you want to do it as far as tracing your body's origins back in your I guess you could say your terrestrial lineage. That's okay. I understand that. But on a soul level, you are an etheric being. That's what you first have to understand. So you came before the body. So why identify and limit yourself to saying, well, I'm a reptilian because, I basically trace myself back to that, and I feel like you're talking against my race or whatever. Why limit yourself to that? Because at the end of the day, we are all reptilians. If you get dry when you go outside, if you got to put on lotion to feel okay, if you got to take baths periodically, if you got to drink water all the time, you have reptilian in you. You are a hybrid of the reptilians, and that's anybody out there. And that's what's wrong with a lot of researchers out there And I've read some of David Icke's information. He does speak of the reptilians like it's separate from human beings. He doesn't go into the fact that we are all reptilian, because I don't know if he wasn't familiar with that, or the case may be. I know he worked with a shaman named Credo Mutwa, and I've done other videos talking about reptilians, and you can kind of go back and check those out. So he worked with a shaman by the name of Credo Mutwa, and Credo Mutwa taught him about what his experiences were with the reptilians. And what you got to remember is that there's different versions of reptilians. You have what's called the humanoid version of a reptilian, which is a presentable reptilian, or one who may have a lot of reptilian DNA inside of them, more so than other humans. However, they still look for the most part human. But then you have real hideous reptilians out there that look just like lizards. Physical. These are the rulers of the reptilians that live in the center of the earth. Most people have never seen them unless you've seen them in dreams or visions, or you were able to astral project and have an experience with them. But most people have not seen this version of reptilian. This is the hideous, gruesome, ugly-looking, like Enemy Mine type looking reptilians, like the movie Enemy Mine. I told you guys to watch that movie. These are reptilians that look like that. They look straight up like snakes or whatever. And I realized that the reptilians were definitely a part of the experiments that the Anunnaki engaged in to create this version of Homo sapiens, or human beings here on this particular planet. And I do realize that melanated beings were the first of the fruits. Melanated beings were the first of the fruits in these experiments. We are the oldest Homo sapiens. I guess you could say even going far past melanated beings, as far as saying coming to this planet, so-called Africans, or whatever you want to call Nubians, or if you want to say Moors, whatever term you want to use, so-called black people, if you want to say that, are the first fruits in these experiments. I realize that. So I do realize that, yes, we have a lot of shared lineage with reptilians. However, what you got to remember is that these experiments continue to go on, and even some melanated people partook in experiments to create other races here on this planet, particularly the Europeans in particular, because when you talk about like Indian races, and like Hindu races, or so-called Indian races, or you talk about Chinese race, these were separate experiments that I would have to do separate videos on. So I'm not saying that they may not have a little bit of reptilian in them, because remember, there was different experiments, but the mixture may not be as much as like Europeans and so-called Africans. We have a lot of reptilian in us. We actually share that lineage as far as reptilian line, whereas a lot of Asians and so-called Indians, they're going into more of insects. They're going into more of that particular lineage. But then you have to remember, we've all mixed in together. So you got certain melanated brothers out there or sisters out there that's got, a lot of insectoid in them. And I'll do a separate video talking about their experiments. So when David Icke is speaking about this stuff, I don't know if he realizes this, but yes, he's a reptilian. There are different factors and aspects of society where reptilians hang out in, and I'll talk about that on the second segment. Now, another point I want to make is that I realized that in ancient Egypt, you see the uraeus, or the snake, coming out of the crown of the pharaoh. You realize in ancient Egypt, you see the snake, and you see a lot of, I guess you could say, amphibian type of symbology associated with ancient Egypt. Now, I realize that, and not only that, in the West Africa, the Dogon tribe, and you hear a lot about just snakes in reference to African culture, African occult mysticism. And the snake, even though, you would say, well, snake is not really a reptile, but when you talk about reptilians, what I'm really getting at is, I want to be more specific. Any type of amphibian or anything, that's dealing with coming out of water onto land is what I'm speaking of when I say reptilians. Yeah, most people think about lizards and the lizards and all of that, but it does go a little bit deeper than that. You have anything that made a transition from water to land, and that can still has to go back and forth to exist. This is what I mean by reptilian. This is my definition of a reptilian. I know there's a million definitions out there, but this is my definition of it. If you have to get in water for a certain amount of time to stay and live on this planet, you have reptilian in you, period. Because when you study the history of the reptilians, they go back to Meldeck. See, the first beings that came here were reptilian, gruesome-looking reptilian, not humanoid-looking, and they came from Meldeck, and they lived in the waters, And they would come out the waters at night when it wasn't hot, but they would get back in the waters in the daytime. But they began to partake in experiments so that they can get ready to come to this planet. So they upgraded their spacesuit. So now you have people, human beings that look like us, but they're still reptilian, but we can live outside of water for a little bit longer. Like we can live on the surface of the planet without water for a little bit longer than the original reptilian inhabitants of this planet. Even in the Sirius star constellation, you have reptilians, but in Sirius it's different because there's different parts of Sirius. Sirius has 3 suns. I think it's Utu, Astu, and Shemesh. These are the 3 suns of Sirius. And reptilians live on the particular part of Sirius, the Sirius star constellation on a planet that doesn't get as much sunlight, and they have to exist in what's called a biosphere because it's a lot hotter, and they live in like an aquarium, sort of, on a planet that's similar to like an aquarium or a biosphere because they have to live in more of a rainforest type of climate to exist on Sirius. And this was an environment that was made for them by higher beings, was called etheric beings. On Sirius, you have etheric beings, beings that, when I say about etheric beings, these are beings that can take the shape of almost anything. They can take the shape of a reptilian, they can shapeshift and disappear and be invisible, they can take the shape of a human being. These are etherians. This is your highest ancestor. When you talk about your ancestors and trace to yourself back, and it doesn't matter who you are as a physical being, your highest ancestor is Etherian. There's different levels of Etherians, like the master teacher taught us. There's different levels of Etherians. You have, level 3, level 6, and level 9, basically. 9 being the highest level, and depending on the level you are, will determine how fast you can shapeshift, what you can shapeshift into, and things of that nature. So you have to keep all of this in mind when you start talking about reptilians. This is what I'm speaking of. This is not no spookism or mumbo jumbo. This is definitely something that science proves, but most people have not really looked into science enough to really be able to prove it. But science proves this. Your higher self is the Etherian. You are more than a reptilian. You're much more than that. So hopefully that answered your question or whatever, as far as like my perspective on it. I'm not trying to make this video extra long. That's my perspective on it. We are all, like I said, reptilians. Just to kind of recap it, we all have different levels of reptilian in us. You have to remember that there are 24 different types of extraterrestrial beings that I've talked about on other videos that are a part of our makeup as a human being now. It's more than just reptilians. You have an ape within you. You have different versions of different beings in you. And what you have to remember is all of these animals, like apes, lions, and tigers, they come from other planets. They're not indigenous to this planet either. Mammals are indigenous to this planet. They have to transport these beings to this planet once the environment was ready for them to be able to thrive and exist. So it's just like if you want to bring some fish home, right? You want these fish to live in your house, but you can't bring the fish home until you got a fish tank. Well, that's how it was for the evolution of beings on this planet, whether they are animals or humans, Homo sapiens. You have to create the environment first, and this is what the Etherians did. This is what some of the higher versions of the Anunnaki did. So some people say like Enki, he was more of a reptilian type, and they say that Enlil was more of the Etherian type that could take on the form and shapeshift a lot faster than Enki. So, there's different levels to the experiment. That's what you have to remember. It's all an experiment, but there's different levels to it. And I could go on, and I know this is opening up a can of worms and more questions are going to be asked, but keep asking me the questions, and I'll just keep making different segments to clarify things for you. But no, it's not racism. I realize that, as far as melanated people, like I said, we were the first fruits on this planet. However, another thing I want to point out, and I'm shutting down after this for real, and then you could just check in part 2, and maybe I'll go into some more in part 2. But another thing I wanted to point out was that there are different species or different, what you could call, so-called races that may have existed, like white people. Even though we say melanated people existed on this planet first, they've had white people were in existence before on other planets. They may not have been able to come here at that particular time yet because we had to make an environment for them to be able to exist in, because there's certain white people or certain Europeans cannot go to certain parts of Africa. If they get bit by certain bugs, they may die. And even certain so-called melanated people can't do it because you've mixed in. But then you go and you deal with certain Africans, they can go to certain parts of Africa and get bit by those insects. They don't got to get a malaria shot to live there because they're indigenous to Africa. So what I'm pointing out is that so-called white people existed in Pleiades and star constellations like that way before there was any life on this planet. There's nothing new up under the sun. So when you say we're older than white people, that's here in this perspective. On this planet, we may be the oldest. We are the oldest. It's a fact. It's not just a maybe. I understand that. But on other planets, when you deal with that time reference, there were so-called white people in existence then, and I'm sure the cycle went the same, of course. Of course, melanated beings probably seeded the planet first, and then certain experiments happened. And then we have white people. What you have to remember, these are different versions of the Matrix. These are different versions of the story, different perspectives. So I hope that helped. There's no right or wrong. Only experience. Keep doing your research. Everything that I've talked about is out there. If you really take the time to look it up, you'll understand it a lot more. So I hope that helped on the reptilian information. And stay tuned for my next video. And I'm out. Hold tight.